All right, good morning. We're going to start in just a couple minutes. The Sicha we're studying today is in Likkutei Sichos, volume 11, and it's the second Sicha for Parsha Shmos. Last week we concluded volume 10, which was on the book of Bereshis and the book of Genesis, and this week we begin the book of Exodus, the book of Shmos, and we move on to a new chelek, a new volume of Likkutei Sichos. In the project Likkutei Sichos, we're going to be studying Shmos, Va'era, and Boy in this volume, and then starting with Bishalach, we're going to move on to volume 16, Chelek Tezayin. Last year, the project started on Yud Shvat. We started with Parshas Bishalach in Chelek Yud in volume 10, and we did the full cycle of completing volume 10, 11. Started in volume 11, Parshas Bishalach. We completed volume 11, 12, 13, 14. Starting the beginning of 11 this week. We'll conclude the first three parshas in this one, and then we move on to volume 16 in about 3 weeks. So the topic of this week's Sicha, of this week's talk on the parsha, is about the relationship between Moshe Rabbeinu, between Moses and Mashiach, the ultimate redeemer of the Jewish people. So obviously, Moses was a redeemer of the Jewish people, and Mashiach will be the ultimate redeemer of the Jewish people. In this Sicha, the Rebbe explores the relationship between the two and how during the times of Moshe, during the times of Moses, the Jews were not yet fully prepared. They were not completely ready to receive the ultimate redemption with the coming of Mashiach, and that's why Moses had to do his part, his work, and the Jewish people had to do their work relative to their time, and only when Mashiach comes will the work in our current exile be complete, and only then will we merit to the complete redemption with the coming of Mashiach. So as we did last week, we'll read the text of the Sicha at a steady pace. I'll translate to English and offer commentary as we go through the Sicha. So we're in volume 11 of Likkutei Sicha, starting on page number 8. Al HaPasuk, on the verse in the parsha, Shlach no biyad tishlach, when God appoints Moses to be his emissary to lead the Jewish people out of Egypt, Moses is reluctant. He hesitates and he asks God to send someone else. That's what it seems to be. He says, please send someone else. Isa b'medrash, so the Medrash explains and interprets this to mean, Amar Moshe lefanov. Moses tells God, Rebbeinu shel olam, Lord Almighty, Shlach no biyad tishlach, send someone else. Biyad Mashiach shehu asid legales. Instead of me, send Mashiach. Send Mashiach, who will be the ultimate redeemer of the Jewish people. He will eventually be revealed to the Jewish people at some point in our history anyway. So why go through the motions of exile and redemption and exile and redemption? Just bring the ultimate redemption with Mashiach right away without any hesitation, any wait. So Moshe was basically saying, not that I don't want the job, but he knew that his function would be temporary in a way, and therefore he requested that Mashiach be sent instead of him. Moshe's current request was not accepted. God's will at this point was specifically and particularly Moshe should be the one, the emissary, to redeem and lead the Jews out of Egypt. From this dialogue in the Medrash, we understand therefore requested his mission, the mission that God was hoping to entrust him with, to redeem the Jews from Egypt, which was given to him, because there is evidently a relationship between Moshe and Mashiach. Therefore, Moshe felt comfortable requesting that instead of him being the one, to redeem the Jews from Egypt, it should be Mashiach. Ella, nevertheless, although there is this connection between Moshe and Mashiach, nevertheless, the redemption, the exodus from Egypt, still had to be affected by Moshe. And the function of Mashiach is dafka gu'ulasin shel Yisrael megalusan ha'achrein, that will only be realized with the ultimate redemption. So Moshe is the one that redeems the Jews from the Egyptian exile, and Mashiach is the one that redeems the Jews from the final exile after our current exile. What is the relationship? What is the actual relationship between Moshe and Mashiach? The actual relationship that the Jews had, that Moshe has with Mashiach, shebein Moshe v'Mashiach, and because they have a relationship, their function is also similar, which is legal as bnei Yisrael megalusam, to redeem the Jews from exile. So Moshe and Mashiach both had a similar function. Both of them had the job to take the Jews out of Egypt. How do we understand this relationship or this similarity between Moshe and Mashiach? Moving up Maimer Razal, based on the teaching of our sages, Moshe hu goyel rishon hu goyel achron. Moshe is the first redeemer of the Jewish people and is also the final redeemer of the Jewish people, which seems enigmatic because obviously Moshe was the redeemer of the Jewish people only when they left Egypt. He is not the Mashiach. He's not the one that takes the Jews out of the final exile, the current Golus. This does not mean that Moshe himself will be he will be the final redeemer, for the very simple reason Moses was from the tribe of Levi. Mashiach will be a descendant of the house, the monarchy of King David, who was Mishevet Yehuda, from the tribe of Yehuda, the tribe of Judah. So obviously it doesn't mean that Moshe will be the final redeemer. The final redeemer will be a descendant of King David from the tribe of Yehuda. The meaning over here is Moshe, who in this context is the first redeemer, the redeemer of the from the Egyptian exile, through the power that he influenced in his generation, he enabled there to eventually be an ultimate redemption with the coming of Mashiach. What was Moshe's power that he affected and therefore enabled the ultimate redemption with Mashiach? The Torah, meaning God's wisdom and the study of Torah. When the Rambam, when Maimonides discusses the qualities of the individual that will be Mashiach, the first thing he says about him is that he has to be hoiga Torah. He has to be fluent and toiling constantly in Torah study. That's the most important quality of Mashiach. B'hainu, how does this individual have the power and the ability to be the redeemer of the Jewish people? Who it is as a result of his Torah study. Shehi Torah Moshe, which, as we know, is the Torah that Moshe taught us. And in a similar way, the power that the Jewish people have today, our strength, our abilities today to bring the ultimate redemption through our service in this world, who al yedei haTorah, is through our Torah study. So, what makes Mashiach special, what makes him unique, is that he is an extreme Torah scholar. What makes us unique, that we can affect the ultimate redemption, that we have the ability and the power to bring Mashiach and to bring the ultimate redemption today, that is also through our Torah study, as we will soon elaborate on. The Sichos Pnimizu, this internal and this innermost and deeper relationship, shebein Mashiach u'Moshe, that exists between Mashiach, the ultimate redeemer, and Moshe, the first redeemer, Mirumezes gam bazeh is alluded to also through the fact that Shabias Mashiach Nikras Yavoy Shiloi. The arrival of Mashiach, as was mentioned in last week's parsha, in Yaakov's blessings and Jacob's blessings to his sons, that it is referred to by the name of Yavoy Shiloh, literally translating as Shiloh will arrive, Shiloh will come. But the words Yavoy Shiloh, the Hebrew words Yavoy and Shiloh, have the numerical value, the gematria of the word Mashiach. So because numerologically Yavoy Shiloh alludes to Mashiach, that means that Ki Yavoy Shiloh, that when Shiloh will come, will arrive, Ainu, which refers to Giluyoy Shel Mashiach Ubiyase B'Poel, the actual realization and the revelation of Mashiach, who begematria Mashiach, that is epitomized and therefore alluded to in the numerical value of the word Mashiach. V'shiloi, but the word Shiloh itself, without the word Yavo, without the word will come, but rather just the word Shiloh, is begematria Moshe. So the numerical value of the word Shiloh is identical to the numerical value of the word Moshe. Hainu, this implies Mashiach hasn't yet come, but we still had Moshe, and Moshe is therefore relates to Shiloh because they share the same numerical value, they share the same gematria. Hakoyach al biyase shel Mashiach, the potential for Mashiach to come, who in Yoni shel Moshe, that exists within Moshe himself. So just to quickly explain what this means, Yavo Shiloh, which means the actualization and the actual final redemption and the arrival of Mashiach, that is the gematria, that shares the numerical equivalent, the numerical value of Mashiach. But Shiloh himself, prior to Yavo, prior to the time that Mashiach actually arrives, is the gematria of Mashiach, of Moshe. Therefore, the Rebbe concludes here that Moshe represents the potential for Mashiach to come, and Mashiach represents the actual redemption, the actual final arrival of Mashiach. V'hinei, in addition to this, Yedua Sichos Kvartushas Mordecham Yadmur, the Rebbe's father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, has a fairly well-known talk, a fairly well-known sicha, that Yavoy Shiloi, the word Yavoy begematria Echad, is shares the numerical value of the word Echad, which is one. The three letters that make up the word Echad share the gematria of the word Yavoy, which means will arrive. So Echad, together with Moshe B'tziruf Echad, the numerical value of Moshe, along with the numerical value of the word Echad, is the gematria of Mashiach. Yavoy Shiloh, we said, Yavoy Shiloh shares the gematria of the word Mashiach. Moshe shares the gematria of only the word Shiloh. And because Yavoy shares the gematria of the word Echad, together with Moshe, represents the numerical value of Mashiach. B'hainu, shebiyasei Mashiach b'poel, the actual arrival of Mashiach, Yavoy, it is through our spiritual service in a manner of Echad, which we will explain soon as well. The strength and the ability that we have to affect this service, this was given to us, this was imparted to us by Moshe. Therefore Moshe, who enables us to perform this service, B'tziruf Echad, in combination, along with the word Echad, Havodah Atma, which is the service itself, B'gematria Mashiach, together, all of these total Mashiach. Echad, the service, and Moshe, who enables us to do the service, together, the numerical value of that is Mashiach. Now, all these are very, very fine and esoteric statements, but we need to understand, we need to actually explain what the service that Moshe enables us to do, which will eventually affect the coming of the ultimate redemption with Mashiach. V'habir b'zeh. to explain. Amru Razal, our sages have stated, Olam al milui nivra. A statement in the Medrash that the world was created perfectly, with everything in it. Nothing in God's world is missing. There are no deficiencies in this world. Hainu shekasher nivra ha'olam, when the world was created, ha'yukol inyonav b'shleimusam, everything existed in the world perfectly. But as we know today, the world is not perfect. What happened? Through the sin of the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge. The snake, the serpent, approached Chava, caused her to sin. He introduced a certain contamination into the world. And therefore man was degraded, as well as the world, from its original perfection and level. This descent or this degradation of man and world continued and existed until the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. At that point, man and the world were elevated from this descent, from this step down, because this contamination that existed in the world ceased once the Jews were standing at the feet of Mount Sinai, at the foot of the mountain. So you think that that's perfect now. The world is completely back to normal. There was a contamination introduced into the world through the sin, and then the Jews standing at Mount Sinai now completed the return. They eradicated this contamination, and everything is back to the way it should have been, back to the way it was. But then, as we know, Shuv Ba Yerida, there was another slide, another slip, another descent. Immediately after that, through the sin of the golden calf. And this contamination now returned. And it still exists in the world until the arrival of the ultimate redemption, at which time the blessing or the wish of our sages will come to fruition. That is, or rather for the wish of the prophet Zechariah, who says that at that time, in the times of Mashiach, this spirit of impurity will be eradicated from the world. At that point, this contamination will be completely nullified, completely eradicated. The world will become refined and purified, and elevated to an ultimate level of refining. Will be ultimately elevated, refined, and purified. As we know, every time there's a descent, every time there's a step back, the purpose of this descent, the purpose of this step back is so that we can eventually elevate ourselves, ascend to a higher level than we were previously. The purpose of stepping down from a previous level is in order that there should be an elevation that immediately follows. Sometimes it's not immediate, but it's always as a direct result of that descent. How they move on, this tells us the elevation or the ascent that comes after the descent. Obviously, the elevation that follows the descent has to be greater than the elevation that existed beforehand. So if you start off at this point and then you drop, going back to where you were originally has no purpose. What was the point of the drop? Rather, if you start off here and you drop a little, you descend a little, and then you elevate to much greater heights, that expresses the ultimate purpose of the descent. We'll move on. From this we understand the level to which the elevation reached through Matan Torah, through the Jews receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, which followed the descent that was caused through the sin of the tree of knowledge. the elevation that existed or that came into effect with the giving of the Torah was much greater than the level that the world and man were on before the sin of the tree of knowledge. So basically, through the giving of the Torah, the world reached an even greater perfection than it did when the world was originally created. The world was created perfect, as we stated, and then there was a sin, so the world slid into the contamination of impurity. And then through the giving of the Torah, not only did it eradicate this initial contamination, but it reached a much greater level of perfection, even greater than the way the world was before the sin. And therefore, we must say, the same will be the ultimate elevation, which will come with the coming of Mashiach, will also be similarly greater. We'll skip these parentheses for a moment and then go back. It will be greater than the elevation that the Jewish people attained at Mount Sinai when they received the Torah. So the Jewish people received the Torah at Mount Sinai, and then they sinned, which means that again they descended, they were downgraded, they lost their original, they lost their, they were removed from their original level that they attained at Mount Sinai, and that was caused through the sin of the golden calf. But when Mashiach comes and we experience this ultimate elevation, this ultimate return to holiness and spirituality, when again the contamination and the impurity is nullified, that elevation will be even greater than the elevation attained at Mount Sinai, which occurred koydem chet ha'egel, before the sin of the golden calf. The advantage, the greatness of this elevation, which occurs after following a descent. What is the advantage of this elevation over the previous elevation? Hibieser says is extreme. It's an extremely greater elevation than the elevation that existed before. In two ways is it going to be much greater. First of all, from the perspective of the infinite godly light that comes down from on high to this world, that will be much greater. And the elevation of man, of the Jewish people, and the world will also be much greater than they ever were previously. So when Mashiach comes, the world will not only reach the perfection that existed during the giving of the Torah, not only will the drawing down and the inspiration that we receive from the infinite light of God be as great, but it will be infinitely and extremely greater. As we see with regards to the elevation that existed when the Torah was given. Before the Torah was given to the Jews on Mount Sinai, they already had the ability to perform mitzvahs. So Voloshan Rambam, as Maimonides states, that al shisha dvarim nitztava adam harishon v'chulu v'hoisiv l'noich ever min achai chulu u'ba'avram v'nitztava yeser aleilo v'yitzchak chulu v'yakov hoisiv. Adam was commanded to observe 6 specific mitzvahs. Then Noach added Abram min achai, the prohibition against eating a limb of a live animal. That's where we have the 7 Noahide laws. And then came Avraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov, and they each added laws that became binding for all of mankind, especially the descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So they still had they already at that point had the ability to perform mitzvahs and fulfill God's will. Bamru Chazal and our sages state that not only did they observe those few mitzvahs, but they actually observed the entire Torah before it was given. Im kol zeh, still, it is specifically with the giving of the Torah, that's when this thing was innovated. Not only did the observance of mitzvahs now become a little bit better, or a lot better, or a lot stronger than there was before, Elagam The entire notion of God choosing us. God specifically chose the Jewish people. This selection, this choice that God makes for us emanates from God's essence. Reaching far beyond any illumination, any revelation, which may have existed. This light and this revelation may have existed before the Torah was given, but with the giving of the Torah, it came down to earth, and God specifically chose the Jewish people. That's what we mentioned, that there's two parts. There's God's great infinite light that is greater at the giving of the Torah, and also when Mashiach comes than it was previously, and the same goes for the level of the Jewish people and the world. Despite the fact that after the Jews sinned and created a golden calf, the contamination returned. They did not return completely to the level of contamination that they were in, that they found themselves in before the Torah was given. Because the refinement, the elevation, and the nullification of the contamination that existed at Matan Torah, at the giving of the Torah, was on a much greater level, was much greater than the level of perfection that existed before the sin of the golden calf. It was a much more internal and penetrating effect. Therefore, even after there was the sin of the golden calf, the effect of the giving of the Torah still existed. So while there was a descent, it was not nearly as bad as it was prior to the giving of the Torah. So if we were going to look at it as a graph of sorts, the world started here where everything was perfect. It dropped substantially with the sin of the golden calf, with sin of the sin of the tree of knowledge. It went back up greater than it was originally with the giving of the Torah. It dipped again with the sin of the golden calf, and then with Mashiach, it will rise exponentially from that. So it's slight dips and elevations throughout our history that eventually lead us to the coming of Mashiach. Similarly, this will also come to a head with the coming of Mashiach. Mashiach will teach all Jews Torah. Specifically Mashiach's Torah. Similar to the elevation and the ascent that existed at the feet of Mount Sinai when the Jews received the Torah. But this will be an extremely greater elevation than the elevation that the Jews experienced at Mount Sinai. And it's also in those two aforementioned areas, the revelation of godliness from above will be greater, and the level of the Jews and the world will also be much greater when Mashiach comes. How will that happen? The Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya. Despite the fact that the revelation of godliness at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai was a very tangible vision. The Jews actually saw this revelation of godliness. Nevertheless, it was only a taste. It was a sample of what we will experience with the ultimate redemption and with the coming of Mashiach. That was great. And if you like that taste, if you like that sample, imagine what the real thing will be like. From this we understand, when we reach the level of God's true glory being revealed, the revelation of the infinite light of God, which will occur when Mashiach comes, who Naila Yoser is far greater, it is far greater than the level of godliness that was revealed at Mount Sinai. And this relates also to the level of the Jewish people in this world. And again, we're working both ends of this equation. We're working on God himself, the light of God being extremely great, even greater than it was previously. And now also from our perspective, from the perspective of the Jewish people in the world, when Mashiach comes, Yukuyim Mashakazuv, the prophecy of Yeshaya, Isaiah, will come to realization. The spirit of impurity will be completely eradicated from this world, and death, which represents all forms of evil, will be completely swallowed up eternally, forever. We will never return to any levels of impurity and contamination. What does that mean? Not the way it was when the Torah was given. It was suspended. The contamination was merely suspended. But there was still the potential for it to return. It was a suspension of evil. It was a suspension of the contamination and of the impurity. But it wasn't permanent. We see that, in fact, this impurity did return with the golden calf. The refinement, the purification that occurred within the world at that time, did not come from the world itself. Rather, because there was a revelation of godliness from above, so the world at the time temporarily suspended its contamination. And therefore, once the episode at Mount Sinai ended and the shofar was blown, and then the shofar stopped, the sound of the shofar stopped, once this revelation ceased, the contamination was now allowed to return, potentially. That was with the revelation at Mount Sinai. When Mashiach comes, at that point, the impurity and the contamination will be eradicated entirely. Therefore, the world itself, from its own perspective, will become refined and purified. And therefore, the elevation that will come as a result of the coming of Mashiach and the ultimate redemption, that will penetrate. This revelation will penetrate the world in a permanent fashion, as we mentioned in the daily Tanya Chitas of the last several days. That the only time something can be considered true and authentic is if it endures, if it lasts forever. Anything that is temporary cannot be considered completely true and authentic and genuine. But something that exists forever, something that never ends, only that is the ultimate truth. So when we call Mashiach, the ultimate redeemer of the Jewish people, that means that he will be the final and the true redeemer, ushering in the final redemption, a redemption that will have no exile to follow. We're up to chapter 4 on page 10 in the Sichos. From the fact that we've now established that through a descent we reach a much greater level than previously. Move on. This descent exists only as an impetus for the elevation that follows. It is only through the service in this state of descent that will affect and bring about this elevation. You can't do it when you're in a constant state of elevation. There has to be that dip so that you can eventually rise. Similar to the way the giving of the Torah only came about following the preparation and the laying of the land, so to speak, of our ancestors, of the forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and then followed by the refinement and purification, the kur habarzel of the iron kiln, which is a reference to Mitzrayim, a reference to the slavery in Egypt. All this, the work of our ancestors, and the exile in Egypt, in this iron kiln. This prepared the Jewish people and the world for them to be able to eventually receive this revelation at Mount Sinai with the giving of the Torah. Similarly, through all of our work, our service to God, our spiritual service throughout this long and extended exile, as we go about our service, we refine and we purify the world to the extent that the world itself, from its own perspective, will become purified, refined, and elevated canal, as we mentioned. Only then, only after our extreme descent, which enables us to refine and purify the world, only then will the ultimate redemption come. This will be better understood with the preface of the famous question al Mashakosov, on the verse, not only a verse in the Torah, but it's part of our daily prayers, and it's the most foundational prayer of the Jewish religion. Shema Yisrael Gomer Hashem Echad. We conclude the Shema, the first verse of the Shema, with the word Echad, referring to God being one. The Lechura, seemingly, it would have been more appropriate to use the term Hashem Yachid. God is the only one, or God alone. Milas Echad, the word one, as opposed to alone, does not indicate God's true and ultimate unity, God's oneness. When we say one, it can often apply that it's one as part of a count. Because after one, you count two, and so on. That's why with regard to Hashem, with regard to God's unity, it says in Koheles, Yesh echad ve'ein sheni. This one God does not have a second to him. But wouldn't it have been a lot easier to say Yachid, and therefore we would not have to negate the potential for there to be a Sheni, a second one. Using the word Echad alone does not negate the potential for there to be another existence. But had the Torah used the word Yachid alone, and in that case, there would have been no room to potentially give credence to a second existence. So why in the Shema do we use the word Echad? The Abir Bazeh, as explained in Chassidus, that itself is the reason the term is used. In other words, the Torah wants you to potentially think that there could be a second. And in that potential, you should realize that there is no second, there is no other to Hashem. The ultimate oneness of God's unity will not be recognized b'shlilas kol metzias zulasai meikare b'bchinas yachid. If we want to highlight how great God's oneness is, that will not be accomplished through negating and nullifying any other type of existence, ever. That's what the word Yachid means. God is alone and nothing else exists. Ki'im dafka, specifically, kasher yeshna mitzius shalaylam, when there is an apparent existence of a world, and still within the world itself, the world itself can feel that it itself has no true existence. Specifically, through this frame of mind, can the world truly recognize God's oneness, God's unity. This is why the term Echad, one, is used rather than Yachid. Even in a situation where the world's existence could potentially be a factor, nevertheless, the world is completely one with God. So if there is no potential for an existence outside of God, then what's the big deal? God is one. God always was one. There was a world. There was no world. It doesn't matter. But because there is a world, because we recognize the existence of the potential for there to be a world and its own existence and its own taking up its own space within the universe that God created, and in that world itself, we recognize that everything is really all part of Hashem. That is the ultimate recognition of God's unity. And this is implied within the word echad itself. The three letters that make up the word echad, the last letter is daled. The letter daled represents the number 4. Daled ruchas ha'olam, the four corners of the world. The letter ches, the middle letter, number 8, represents Zayin Rokim v'aretz, the 7 heavens and the earth. Milo Mata, representing up and down. So there's the 4 corners, northwest, east and south, and then up and down. All that is included in Aleph. Aleph is the number 1. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Alufay Shel Olam. God is the one or the most exceptional, the only true one existence in the world. The interpretation over here of the word echad is we must draw down and reveal God's divinity, God's existence, which is alluded to with the letter aleph of the word echad, ba'olam, within the world, which is alluded to in the letters ches and daled. Shagam ba'olam, in the world itself, lashon helam v'hester, the Hebrew word for olam is etymologically similar to the Hebrew word for concealment, helam v'hester, within the world's own existence. The entire existence of the world is God's exceptional existence. The aleph of the word echad, which refers to God, the most exceptional and the only exceptional existence in this universe. That's the first letter of the word. The subsequent letters of ches and daled are included and therefore nullified before this aleph. So the entire existence of the world, which we recognize through the letters of ches and daled, have no real existence of their own other than the aleph of the word echad, which refers to God himself. That's why the word echad is used in the Shema instead of the word yachid. But still, this one question stands out. How could the world, which, as we said earlier, represents a concealment of godliness, how could it be a kli, a receptacle, a vessel to receive, and not only receive, but to eventually reveal God's exceptionalism? So to that end, the Jewish people received the Torah and mitzvahs, the Matan Torah at Mount Sinai, so that through them, and through them, so within them and through them, they will refine and purify the world. They will create a dwelling place for God within this physical, lowly world. And that's accomplished through Torah and mitzvahs. So at Mount Sinai, the Jewish people were given the strength and the ability to refine and purify the world. Not only were Torah and mitzvahs given them, and through this Torah mitzvahs, the world becomes a dwelling place for God. In addition to that, the actual revelation of godliness at the giving of the Torah, and the level that the world attained at that point, so although the event at the giving at Mount Sinai, at the giving of the Torah, was temporary, but that implemented and enabled the Jewish people and the world to continue this act of refinement and purification of the world even after the conclusion of the events at Mount Sinai. How did that occur? When the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, the world was completely nullified. It was such a spiritual, supernal event that the world could not contain and cannot continue existing in its current manner. Because of this great revelation that came from above. This nullification was felt within the world itself. As our sages state with regards to the events surrounding the giving of the Torah, birds did not shriek, the entire world came to a standstill. The world was silent, mute. Although the world itself, the way it exists on the surface, the way we see it, was not yet ready, was not in a position to receive this great light that was revealed at Mount Sinai. It had to be nullified. Its existence could not remain the same. The way the world was prior to the giving of the Torah, this revelation could not have penetrated the world. So the world had to become nullified. It had to lose its original identity. It had to come. The only way it could have happened was through this great revelation that occurred from above. And therefore, as we mentioned earlier, it was only temporary. But still, it had an effect. In a this nullification that occurred at the giving of the Torah Mount Sinai, this enabled the world to become refined and purified and elevated afterwards, so that it eventually becomes a receptacle and a dwelling place for God. So although it was an extremely spiritual event that the world itself could not handle, the world had to suspend its true, or its identity, its existence at the time. Nevertheless, once it occurred, it did penetrate the world, and there was a process of refinement and purification and elevation that existed in the world that continued even after the giving of the Torah. But as we mentioned, and as we have discussed earlier at length, after the giving of the Torah, the Jews still sinned. There was still a descent, there was still a drop in their level, in the world's level of spirituality. There was contamination introduced to the world. So therefore, it wasn't permanent. It was a temporary occurrence, and the permanent revelation of godliness, as we'll conclude now in the next page and a half, is the coming of Mashiach. Page 12, chapter 7, Zion. This now helps us understand how the word Moshe, together with the word Echad, one, shares the numerical value of the word Mashiach. Moshe represents Matan Torah. Moshe enabled us. Moshe introduced the potential to refine the world with Echad, with this one. And as we said earlier, that means introducing godliness, Aleph, into Ches and Daled, into the existence and identity of the physical world. Our continued service through the ability and potential granted to us through Moshe, through Moses, that will eventually affect and bring about the ultimate redemption with Mashiach. So Moshe himself was only the potential. Moshe also introduced to us the concept of Echad, the concept of bringing God's oneness into the world and making everything one with God. And that is our job now, our function now in exile, and that will lead eventually to the coming of Mashiach. Al Pizeh, according to this, with all this in mind, we understand Sichos HaPnimi has been Moshe and Mashiach, the inner connection, the inner relationship between Moshe and Mashiach. The ultimate redemption is actualized through Mashiach. But he does so, Mashiach does so with the potential and the strength granted to us and to him by Moshe. It emanates, it comes from Moshe, and through him, through the potential given to us by Moshe, we are able to come closer to the time of the revelation of Mashiach. So Mashiach is an extension of Moshe. Moshe is the potential, Mashiach is the realization of this potential. But there's still a difference between Moshe and Mashiach. Meidach, still, the difference between them is quite obvious. Although Moshe was indeed the redeemer of the Jewish people, the purpose, the ultimate purpose of the slavery, the bondage, and the exile in Egypt, and eventually the Jewish people's exodus and release from Egypt was to receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. As the Torah tells us, God tells Moses, when you take the Jews, when you release the Jews from Egypt, you shall serve them, you shall serve God on Mount Sinai. And then the giving of the Torah, which is embodied by Moshe. As we said earlier, this is in addition to the fact that at Mount Sinai, God chose the Jewish people. But generally speaking, the events at Mount Sinai represented and embodied Moshe's entire life work. It is only the delivery of potential for us to refine and purify the world. Potential. What Mashiach brings is the completion of this refinement and purification. And the primary purpose of the giving of the Torah is not what occurred on Mount Sinai, but the service and the work that the Jewish people implemented afterwards. And then that's followed by the coming of Mashiach and the service that follows that when the world is already purified and refined. So Mashiach, on one hand, is an extension of Moshe. Moshe started this concept of redemption, and Mashiach concludes it. But they're still not the same. Moshe is potential, and Mashiach is the actualization of this potential. So when God tells Moshe to take the Jews out of Egypt, Moshe says, send Mashiach. Because he realized the relationship between the concept of Moshe and the concept of Mashiach. And God says no, because right now, this is potential. We're not ready for the actualization and the realization of this potential. That will only happen with the ultimate redemption with Mashiach. So right now, you, Moshe, you take the Jews out of Egypt, prepare them to receive the Torah with all the ups and downs that will follow, and then ultimately we arrive at Mashiach. Now we conclude. Man is compared to a small miniature world. Just as the process is in the world earlier, as we mentioned, the same similarly exists within every person's day-to-day life. When a person goes out to do his own work, his own business, until the evening, morning to night, which is how we are generally occupied. Most people are occupied morning to evening in their own individual pursuits. And then at night, the final verse of the bedtime Shema is I entrust with you, God, my spirit, my soul. And then the next morning you become a new creation. As we awake, our soul returns to our body. And now we begin a new form of service every day. We go to sleep at night, we return our soul to God, wake up in the morning refreshed, our soul returns to us, and we start over. The person's daily service must begin with prayer and Torah study. As the Medrash says, L'beis HaKnesses, M'beis HaKnesses, L'beis HaMedrash, you go from the house of prayer to the house of study and so on. Through opening and starting your day with prayer and Torah study, you have the potential, you have the strength to serve God within the world as we know it. Your godly soul spreads itself, expands itself throughout your entire body. That's accomplished through prayer. Again, as we mentioned, the daily Tanya lessons in Chitas, the Beinoni, the intermediate level between a tzaddik and a rasha, which the book of Tanya is written for, is an extremely lofty level. And the Tanya says specifically, the Alter Rebbe says that the Beinoni excels specifically during his time of prayer, because during his prayer is when the Nefesh Elokis, the godly soul, has complete control over the person. And he's able to control and to rule over his evil inclination of and in the physical universe that surrounds him. And then that's followed by Torah study. It's considered a spice or a poison that's used to dissolve the evil inclination. Torah study guides you so that you can serve God throughout your day during your own personal pursuits. So we started off with prayer, and then we continue, we follow that with Torah study, and that is followed by working with the actual physical, tangible world. Bringing within the world the spirituality that we obtained through Torah and prayer. As the Rambam, as Maimonides states, a wise person must be recognizable that he's a wise person when he eats and drinks and in all other daily physical pursuits. In all of these pursuits, it must be recognizable that he is a wise person who has eyes in his head, which is an expression used to describe someone who not only knows what he wants right now, but also has an idea of where it will lead him. And that way he can control this city, this small city, Irktana, which is the person. He controls this small municipality through his wisdom. Hachad, the ches, and the dalid in the word echad, which represent the world, batal becomes nullified leha aleph to the aleph, alufi shel olam, God, aleph chachma, through becoming exceptional in wisdom, through davening, through prayer, and through Torah study. We are able to control and be the most exceptional being within this physical universe that we exist in on a daily basis. And then the day concludes, after all of our service, both of our personal pursuits and our spiritual pursuits. A man then needs to do an accounting. It needs to be an honest accounting of everything that he accomplished during the day. In our final prayer of the day, we once again highlight our function as being the tool to bring godliness into the world, into every area of the world. That's why we say this verse, in your hands, in God's hand, we entrust our spirit. And this verse concludes with the words, Kael Emes, true God. And the word Emes, which means true, is also spelled with 3 letters. Emes, this word Emes, who al derech b'chinas echad, is similar to the word echad hanal that we mentioned earlier. As the verse states, Emes havai elolam, God is true forever. The Isabi Yerushalmi, and as the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud states, God's stamp or God's mark on the universe, on the world, is true. What does this word emes represent? The three letters that spell out the word emes, aleph, mem, and taf. The aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Umem, the letter mem, is the middle, emtseisan. It is smack in the middle of the Hebrew alphabet, if you count all the end letters. The taf, and the letter taf is achroina shaboisis, is the final letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And this refers to a verse that states, "Ani rishon v'ani achrein," I am the first, I am the last. Mibaladei ein elikim, and other than me there is no God. Hainu shebechol inyanei ha'olam min hakatza lakatza, in all areas of the universe, from one end of the world to the extreme opposite end, yumshach v'yizgala, we must bring down and reveal emes havayag, God's truth. Alufay shel olam. Again, God is the only truly exceptional being in this world. And from God's true existence, nimtzu kol hanimtzoim, all other existences emanate from, as the Rambam says. And that's why in the commentators on the Talmud, they say, shebeheisir aleph mimilas emes, if you remove the letter aleph from the word emes, nishar, what you're left with is mes, death, God forbid. Heipech inyan hachayim. Again, the aleph represents God, and in our context now, it represents Torah study, to bring the word and the wisdom of God, aleph chachma, God's wisdom, into the universe. Absent that aleph, all that we have left is the opposite of life, God forbid. And just as in general, we receive the potential to purify and refine the world at Mount Sinai when we receive the Torah. The same applies in the specifics work of every individual. Every person has his own part of the world that he needs to purify and refine. Through the work that we've accomplished based on what we were instructed in the Torah, again, the Torah came from Moshe. That leads us, that will lead us to the ultimate general redemption, which again is brought about by Mashiach, brought about by Mashiach, Ba'agala Didan. May it happen in our times. Amen.